Hey everyone, and welcome back. Get ready, because today we're diving into some seriously murky waters. The kind of stories that make you go, hold on, who can you actually trust?
Yeah, some of these are unbelievable.
We're talking royals, religious leaders, the media, all caught up in these webs of scandal and cover-ups.
Mhm.
And to help us unravel it all, we've got the amazing Sonia Poulton with us.
Hi.
She's an investigative journalist who's made a career out of uncovering the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. Sonia, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so let's kick things off with someone who really embodies this whole power and scandal thing, Prince Andrew.
Right.
We all know about his link to Jeffrey Epstein, but there's this whole new layer to this story that's even more unsettling.
Yeah, this supposed friendship with a Chinese businessman who they suspect of being a spy. It's wild how quickly the royals try to distance themselves as soon as it's not convenient anymore.
See, like they suddenly forgot they were ever close, but is that just a PR move, or is there something more going on here?
I think it points to a bigger issue within the royal family. They operate under this idea that they're above scrutiny, beyond reproach.
Right.
We saw it with Andrew's 60th birthday being scaled back because of the Epstein scandal. But it goes even deeper. Look at how they dealt with Princess Diana's death, or the whole Harry and Meghan situation. It's always damage control, always protecting their image.
So if they can't control the story, they just bail.
Exactly. Distance equals plausible deniability. But what's interesting here is that this spy connection wasn't exactly a secret.
Right.
There are photos of him with Andrew at all sorts of events, even royal weddings. So either the royals were incredibly naive or they were totally willing to overlook these potentially risky relationships as long as it worked for them.
Which makes you question their judgment for sure.
Definitely. And their priorities, it makes you wonder, are they truly concerned about national security or is it more about keeping up appearances?
Speaking of questionable judgment, this Bishop Peter Ball case is truly disturbing for those who don't know. He was a big deal in the Church of England and a close friend of King Charles when he was Prince of Wales.
And Ball ended up in jail for abusing teenage boys.
What's truly unsettling is Charles's involvement. He sent Ball a letter defending him after he'd already gotten in trouble for abuse. And then when he was called to testify at the child abuse inquiry, he sent a written statement instead of actually showing up. It's almost as if he was trying to shield Ball from scrutiny.
There's definitely a pattern of Charles hanging out with questionable figures.
Yeah.
Remember his close friendship with Jimmy Savile, who turned out to be a horrific predator?
It's almost impossible to believe Charles didn't know about Savile's behavior. They were so close for years.
Right. And that raises some uncomfortable questions about Charles's judgment, his morals, his willingness to ignore abuse when it suits him.
Which leads us to the Jeffrey Epstein saga. It feels like we've only gotten a carefully edited version of what really happened, and the true extent of his crimes is still a mystery.
Absolutely. The main narrative focuses on older teenagers and massages, conveniently ignoring the possibility of younger victims. There's been a huge effort to sanitize the story to protect powerful figures.
You've mentioned some truly disturbing things about Epstein's ranch in New Mexico, the possibility of even darker crimes, things we haven't really heard about.
And that's the problem. The media hasn't really dug deeper. They've taken the easy way out, accepting the PR spin instead of chasing the truth.
Is it because they're scared of the consequences? We are talking about some seriously powerful people.
Fear definitely plays a role. These institutions, whether it's the royals, the media, or the legal system, they protect their own. Speaking out against these figures can be career suicide.
So how do we break through that wall of silence? How do we actually get to the truth?
It takes brave journalists, those who ask the tough questions, challenge the status quo, and follow the evidence no matter where it leads, even if it implicates powerful people. It also takes citizens demanding accountability, supporting investigative journalism, and refusing to just accept the official story.
Because let's face it, money often buys silence. That settlement Virginia Giuffre received that was clearly meant to keep her quiet.
Exactly, and it sets a dangerous precedent. It tells other victims their stories don't matter, that the powerful can always silence them with money, and it reinforces this idea that justice is for sale.
That's chilling, and it brings us to another powerful figure facing serious allegations, Diddy. He's being called a modern-day Epstein, and the more we learn, the more that comparison seems right. You've said you've met him before, even attended some of his infamous parties.
Yeah, early in my career, I was covering the music scene, so I had some run-ins with Diddy. What's so striking and disturbing is the contrast between his carefully crafted image and the dark allegations coming out now.
What was your impression of him back then? Did you get any sense of this darker side?
He was definitely charismatic, a master manipulator. There was an intensity about him, a darkness under the charm. The parties themselves were multi-layered. Let's say they'd start off innocently enough, but as the night went on, things would shift. Certain guests would disappear into these exclusive areas. The vibe got more secretive, more intense.
And the recent lawsuits allege that these parties were more than just hedonistic gatherings. There are claims of women being drugged, exploited, even trafficked, disturbing details about children being there, even offered up for selection.
Yeah, and these weren't just any parties. We're talking A-list celebrities, politicians, people with massive power and influence.
Which makes the allegations even more disturbing. It's a reminder that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And when you mix that power with wealth and a culture of no consequences, it creates a breeding ground for abuse.
We're going to take a closer look at the Diddy allegations and the similarities to the Epstein case. But first,
It's a pattern you see again and again, powerful men using their money and influence to take advantage of others.
and getting away with it most of the time.
Until they don't, and that's what we're seeing now. The walls are closing in on these predators. More and more victims are speaking out, and the public is becoming more aware of how common this kind of abuse is.
Let's dig a bit deeper into these Diddy allegations. The lawsuits paint a very disturbing picture. There are descriptions of baby oil with relaxants mixed in women being used as serving platters at parties. It's hard to even imagine that kind of depravity.
And then there are the claims about children being at these parties being presented to guests. It's really serious and needs a thorough investigation.
The hypocrisy is what gets me. Diddy cultivates this image of a successful businessman, a family man, a philanthropist, and yet behind closed doors, it's allegedly a completely different story.
That disconnect is part of what makes this so shocking. People have a hard time reconciling the public image with the alleged private behavior, but it's important to remember that abusers are often very good at hiding their true nature. They can be charming, charismatic, manipulative.
And they surround themselves with people who protect them and look the other way.
Exactly. It's a system that allows the abuse to continue, and it's not just Diddy or Epstein. We see this in so many industries, so many institutions.
You mentioned that Jay-Z is now part of one of these lawsuits. That's a big deal.
It is, and it adds another layer to the story. The fact that the lawyer, Tony Busby, waited to add Jay-Z suggests he's been building a strong case gathering evidence.
Busby seems to have a knack for these high-profile cases. He represented some of the Epstein victims too, right?
He did. He's known for being a tough lawyer, someone who's not afraid to go after the rich and powerful.
Which is exactly what we need in these cases.
Absolutely. These powerful figures have gotten away with their crimes for too long. It's time for them to face the consequences.
The BBC seems to be having its own issues with the Hugh Edwards and Philip Schofield scandals. You worked at ITV for a while, so you have firsthand experience with that environment. What are your thoughts on how these situations have been handled?
The Philip Schofield scandal was a perfect example of how these institutions would rather protect their image than anything else. The so-called investigation was a joke. They just swept it all under the rug.
It seems like they were more worried about damage control than finding the truth.
Exactly. And it's a pattern we see all the time. The BBC, with the Hugh Edwards situation, is facing similar accusations of protecting their own, of ignoring misconduct.
It's like these institutions are built on secrecy and complicity.
And that culture of silence lets abuse thrive.
Let's talk about the Madeleine McCann case for a minute. You have a controversial theory about what happened. You believe it was an accident covered up by the parents? Can you tell us more about that?
Sure, I've spent a lot of time researching this case, and I've come to the conclusion that the evidence doesn't support the kidnapping story. There are too many inconsistencies, too many questions without answers.
You've mentioned Martin Frizzell, the former ITV editor and close friend of Philip Schofield, as playing a key role in shaping the abduction narrative in the public eye.
Yes, he was a central figure early on. He allowed one of the McCann's friends to appear on ITV the day after Madeleine disappeared, and she presented the abduction theory as fact. It was brilliant PR, but it wasn't true.
So you're saying the media, whether intentionally or not, manipulated how the public saw the case?
Absolutely, and it shows how powerful the media is in shaping narratives, controlling what information people get.
Which brings us back to this idea of trust. Who can we trust when powerful institutions and individuals seem determined to control the story to protect themselves no matter what?
It's a tough question. I think we all have to be careful about what information we consume. Question everything. Look for different perspectives. Don't just accept the official story as fact.
And support investigative journalism, which is more important now than ever with the rise of social media and all the misinformation out there.
Absolutely, we need to develop critical thinking skills, learn to spot bias, evaluate sources, separate fact from fiction.
What about those of us who feel powerless against these huge institutions? What can we do to actually hold them accountable?
But never underestimate the power of collective action, joining groups, signing petitions, contacting your elected officials. Those actions might seem small, but when enough people get involved, it can put real pressure on these institutions.
So it's about finding our voices and using them even if it feels like we're shouting into the void.
Exactly. Every voice counts. And remember, staying silent only helps the abusers. Speaking out, even when it's uncomfortable, can encourage others to do the same. That's how we break the silence and end the culture of letting these people get away with it.
Speaking of uncomfortable truths, let's discuss the shockingly light sentences or lack thereof that are often given to people caught with child sexual abuse material. How is it possible that 8 out of 10 people who download this horrific content don't go to jail?
It's a horrifying statistic, and it reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of this crime. Judges often say these individuals aren't real pedophiles because they're not directly abusing children, but that's a dangerous and wrong assumption.
Because viewing this material creates demand for it, which fuels the abuse of real children.
Exactly, and the light sentences send the message that this crime isn't being taken seriously, which only emboldens the offenders.
What are the consequences of these lenient sentences?
Well, for one thing, it erodes public trust in the justice system. When people see these awful crimes treated so lightly, it creates outrage and despair, and sometimes it leads to vigilante justice as people take the law into their own hands because they feel the system has failed them.
That's a dangerous and concerning trend.
It is, and it highlights the need for changes in the legal system, for a better understanding of child sexual abuse material, and for a system that puts protecting children first.
We've covered a lot in this conversation, and it's clear that there's a common thread running through all these stories: power, privilege, and a culture of impunity.
Yes, and these are deep-rooted problems in our society. It's going to take a lot of effort from individuals, institutions, and governments to dismantle these systems of abuse and build a world where everyone is safe and respected.
So where do we go from here? What can we do as individuals to make a difference?
First and foremost, we need to educate ourselves. We need to understand these crimes, the tactics abusers use, the warning signs, and we need to talk about these issues openly. And honestly, the more we break the silence, the more we empower victims and make it harder for abusers to hide.
And we need to support organizations fighting against abuse and protecting the vulnerable.
Absolutely. There are incredible organizations doing amazing work, but they need our help, whether it's volunteering, donating, or just raising awareness. We can all play a part in creating a safer world.
Sonia, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. This has been a difficult but essential conversation.
My pleasure.
Wow. Okay, we're back. And I don't know about you, but I'm still processing all that. It's pretty disheartening to see how these powerful people and institutions so often choose to protect themselves instead of doing what's right.
Yeah, it can feel like that, a constant uphill battle.
So how do we even begin to fight back against this culture of impunity? What can we as individuals really do to make a difference?
Well, I always say sunlight is the best disinfectant. Shining a light on these dark corners, exposing the truth. That's the first step.
Okay, so awareness is key. But
Yeah.
then what? How do we turn that awareness into action?
We need to support investigative journalism. Those reporters, those outlets that are willing to dig deep to hold the powerful accountable, they're essential.
So things like subscribing to investigative publications, donating to nonprofit newsrooms, things like that.
Exactly. And beyond that, we can all become more critical about the information we consume. Don't just accept what you see on the surface, question the narratives the media presents. Dig a little deeper, look for evidence, not just opinions.
That's so crucial now more than ever with social media and the constant flood of misinformation.
Absolutely. We need to sharpen those critical thinking skills, learn how to spot bias, how to evaluate sources, how to separate fact from fiction.
What about those of us who feel powerless against these massive institutions? What can we do to actually hold them accountable?
Never underestimate the power of collective action, joining advocacy groups, signing petitions, contacting your elected officials. Those things might seem small, but when enough people get involved, it creates real pressure for change.
So it's about finding our voices and using them, even if it feels like we're shouting into the void.
Exactly. Every voice matters. And remember, silence only benefits the abusers. Speaking out, even when it's uncomfortable, can inspire others to do the same. That's how we break the cycle of silence and impunity.
This conversation has really underscored the importance of being informed, engaged, active citizens.
I agree. We can't just sit back and watch. We have a responsibility to speak up against injustice, to demand accountability, to work towards a world where everyone is safe and respected.
Sonia, before we wrap up, I wanted to touch on something you mentioned earlier about the rise of vigilante groups as a response to the perceived failures of the justice system. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a dangerous and slippery slope. While I understand the anger and frustration that drives this kind of vigilantism, it's ultimately counterproductive. It weakens the rule of law and can lead to miscarriages of justice.
So how do we channel that anger into something constructive?
We need to focus on systemic change. That means pushing for stronger laws, supporting organizations, working to prevent abuse, and demanding accountability from our leaders.
It's a long road ahead. But conversations like this, raising awareness, empowering people to act, that's how we start to create real change.
I truly believe that we have to have hope. We have to believe a better world is possible.
Sonia, this has been a truly eye-opening conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners, I encourage you to check out Sonia Polton's work for more in-depth investigations and analysis on these vital issues. Remember, we all have a role to play in creating a safer and more just world. Don't be afraid to speak up, to demand accountability, and to fight for a world where power is used responsibly and the vulnerable are protected. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep up the good fight.